Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, September 30th, 2025, and our friend John Helmer is joining us. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Nima. Thank you for having me.
John, let's start with the conflict in Ukraine and what Donald Trump said during the meeting with Macron. And he literally called Russia a paper tiger because in his eyes, Russia is doing nothing and they're not capable of advancing. I don't know what's going on in his mind, but here is part of what he said.
I can fight too, and they've proven that. Maybe it could be that Russia is a paper tiger.
Were you surprised by this? He also said, I should add a very important part, that he thought Ukraine will get all the territory back, because for some time we heard that Ukraine was going to have to give up some of the territory that they lost in this war. So were you surprised by this statement, and what changed?
No, I wasn't surprised at all, Martha. And one of the things I really admire about the president's approach to this entire conflict, and frankly, all the diplomatic efforts of the administration, is that it's very grounded in reality and what's happening on the ground. If you go back to the last days of the Biden administration, if you go back to even a couple of months ago, the Russians were conquering large amounts of territory. Every month, they were gaining another couple hundred square kilometers, maybe more than that. And what's happening right now, as the president articulated, is Russia's really stalled. They're killing a lot of people. They themselves are losing a lot of people, and they don't have much territorial gain to show for it. And so the president is looking at the situation. He's saying, look, the Russian economy is in shambles. The Russians are not gaining much on the battlefield. It's clearly time for them to listen to his passionate plea for them to come to the table and actually talk seriously about peace. So you ask what's changed. I think what's changed is the reality on the ground, where the Russians are killing a lot of people. They're losing a lot of people. They don't have much to show for it. We remain committed to peace, but it takes two to tango. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, the Russians have refused to sit down with any bilateral meetings with the Ukrainians. They've refused to sit down with any trilateral meetings where the president or some other member of the administration could sit down with the Russians and the Ukrainians. So our view is we want peace here. We've been actively pursuing peace from the very beginning of the administration, but the Russians have got to wake up and accept reality here. A lot of people are dying. They don't have a lot to show for it. How many more people are they willing to lose? How many more people are they willing to kill for very little, if any, gain in the military advantage on the ground there? I think the answer is hopefully not that much, but certainly our attitude here is we're going to keep on working for peace, and we hope the Russians actually wake up to the reality.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there are three ways of understanding this. First of all, the first way of understanding is that these two U.S. leaders, President Vance, Vice President Vance, candidate President Vance, and President Trump are mad, simply mad. You heard Vance in particular repeat the same line several times over in a matter of less than a few minutes about the reality on the ground. Are you mad to say that so many false things? For a start, the Russians are advancing. They're not stalled. This is false. It's false to say that the Russians have refused to negotiate with and meet with the Ukrainians. That's false. It's false to say that the Russian side has refused to meet with Trump or Trump with Zelensky, unless there are preconditions. Each of these things is false. Each of these things is therefore either mad, or here are the two other interpretations. On the one hand, there's the White House interpretation. Who are these people speaking to, and why do they say this in this way now? It's the first way that's the second way. If you assume they're not mad, they are speaking to a particular audience from the White House. What does it mean in White House politics? The third way is to understand that they're talking to the Russians. And what are they saying to the Russians when they're saying things which the Russian side know to be obviously false? Let's go to the White House interpretation. In the first place, if anyone in the audience thinks that the US is about to launch World War III, it's time to leave the room. That's clickbait. That's designed to build an audience for a podcast. We're not going to talk, folks, about the World War III. If you came to this podcast to listen about that we're on the edge of World War III, time to move on to somebody who'll tell you that every 5 minutes, not us. What's going on here is rational. It's a rational calculation by Trump and Vance, and they're speaking to the political audience which counts for them. Now, let's look at their position. Right now, on the polls, Vance is decidedly more unpopular than Trump himself. Both of them have serious unfavorability ratings. In other words, whatever they say and do is making them more unpopular among American voters. I'm just looking to my side to see Trump's current unfavorability rating, negative popularity, is 52.3 against, I think, 45.4. So call that minus 7 percentage points. But Vance is worse. It's 54 to 42. He's got minus 12. Vance is more unpopular. And this is very important in relation to the Kirk affair and their reaction. Vance is more unpopular than Trump among young American voters, 18 to 24. He's more unpopular with women, 69 to 28. They're roughly same, Trump and Vance, with males. White voters, roughly the same. White Americans have a decidedly more unfavorable view of both of them, roughly equal. But black voters dislike and distrust Vance most. They're roughly the same with Hispanic voters. Now, why do I use these numbers? Because these people are addressing their voters, and we can understand what they're saying in relation to that. The serious problem for Vance is that right now, when people are asked, American voters are asked, who would you vote for? And they pit him as a 2028 candidate against Buttigieg, Newsom of California, and Ocasio-Cortez of New York. Vance hardly gains. He's the sitting vice president. He's only 8 months into his term, and he can't be sure of beating 3 almost no names, nationally speaking. Now, that's a very serious problem. He doesn't really care about the world. He cares about himself, his power, his succession to Donald Trump. So you must read everything Vance says in relation to his base. Now, what's he doing? What he's doing is essentially trying to appeal to his base and saying, we make peace. Second, we're not going to risk, you didn't mention yet the threat of the Tomahawks. We're not going to risk American lives. We'll come to that in a minute. We're going to risk European lives, and we'll get rich at it because we'll get paid to give them the missiles. Reality on the ground, the only one Vance and Trump really care about is their power and their money heading into the midterms next year, 2026, and the White House re-election or election in 2028. But what's unique about Vance is he can't be sure he can beat the Democratic candidates. And who could be worse off at the moment in American politics, more discreditable, more divided and chaotic than the Democratic Party? And yet Vance fails to be sure he could win. All right. So what is he saying? I'm not going to engage you, the American people, certainly not the young ones who might have to fight, in a war in Europe. I'm going to let the Europeans do that, but we're going to charge them for all the weapons they use. What's Trump had to say? Well, we're not going to be nailed with the idea of being pro-Russian. We're very disappointed in President Putin. Trump keeps on saying, we are going to challenge them, but we will get rich at it. The Europeans will have to do the fighting. The Europeans will have to do the paying, and the Ukrainians will have to do the fighting and dying. Why are we going to do this? Because we've got a big opportunity, and here's the mad part, the false part, because the Russians are losing, are stalling, their economy's crumbling. And about that, if you want to look at the details, I yesterday put out a piece on Dances with Bears, my website, just explaining why there are petrol shortages in the southwest of Russia and why that only partially reflects the pinprick attacks the Ukrainians and Americans have fired on Russian refineries. But that's a detail. The big picture is, from a White House point of view, these people are failing. They're getting more unpopular. So what do they do at the moment? They rally their base, or what they think is their base. That's in a nutshell what they think they're saying. Now, are they even talking at the Russians? The answer is no. They're not talking at the Russians. But from the Russian side's point of view, what has happened here is a very clear demonstration that what President Putin personally called the understandings he believed he had with President Trump at the Anchorage summit, Anchorage, Alaska, August 16, 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago. That understanding's gone. Second, there was a meeting by Mr. Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, and Secretary of State Rubio at the United Nations, in which Lavrov made a large communique. Rubio made a three-liner. And Lavrov repeated the line that the understandings reached at Anchorage are progressive, are worth pursuing. We want to continue. But those understandings have been blown away by the way the White House is talking. So what the impact of this on the Russian side is twofold. On the one hand, the Russian side does not want to say President Putin failed at Anchorage, nor do they want to say that President Trump failed at Anchorage or since. Instead, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, and I'm looking down at my notes so I can read exactly what he said, says something that's so obvious, it looks almost silly. He says, we've heard these statements, the ones you just ran, Nima. We've heard these statements. We are thoroughly analyzing them. Our military specialists are closely monitoring it. That's obvious, isn't it? Then he says, even if it happens that the United States sends its Tomahawk missiles to the Ukraine, currently there's no cure-all that could be a game changer on the front lines for the Kiev regime. No magical weapons exist. Tomahawk and other missiles will simply not be a game changer. Then he issues a warning, but he muffles it quietly. The question is this: who can launch these missiles? Can only Ukrainians launch them? Or do American soldiers have to do that? The answer's already obvious. Vance has made it plain. The operators, if the missiles are delivered, like all the other weapons, the operators will be Europeans and Ukrainians. They're the ones the Russian side will have to hit. So on the one hand, you could say the Russian side is missing Vance and Trump's strategic point. The US side seems to be saying, we're getting ready to hit inside the hinterland of Russia. We've got missiles now with potential, if we deliver them and they're fired, with a range to hit Moscow and St. Petersburg. We're daring you because we're calling you a paper tiger. This, at the best you could say, the American side has blown away the understanding the Russian side wanted to sustain from Anchorage by being provocative. And this is a new provocation, just like the allegation that Russia fired drones, unarmed drones, surveillance drones out of range of Russia on Poland, or that it entered Estonian airspace with the MiG-31 flyer. All of this is false on the ground. The reality on the ground, to use Vance's terms, is completely different from the way the Americans have put it, these two Americans. But they're being provocative. They're daring the Russians to do something that would give them even more ammunition to rally their base. So from a Russian point of view, this is very helpful to the general staff, very helpful to the war faction, very negative for the business faction. The business faction, we've talked about this before, is represented by Kirill Dmitriev. They want to make business deals with the American side, business deals that come with reducing sanctions and bringing Russia back into business as usual with the United States. This kind of talk is bad for business. Understandably, bad for business in Moscow around the Kremlin. On the other hand, it's relatively good for the war faction, because the war faction can say, as I say to those podcasters with whom I've differed over these past years and months, we told you so. This is the underlying US line. This is the aggressive US empire, albeit in collaboration with the Europeans. So there are three ways of looking at this. We'll dispense with the Americans. Vance and Trump are mad. They're false, they're lying, but they're not mad. They're addressing their own electorate. And in Moscow, it has a domestic political effect too. And it galvanizes the war faction to prepare for the Oreshnik, but we'll come to that later.
Yeah. John, he was asked about Tomahawk missiles, and the point about Tomahawk missile, I talked with Larry Johnson yesterday, is that they're capable of carrying nuclear bombs.
Yes.
That is important. And here is what J.D. Vance said about Tomahawk missiles.
With them having Tomahawk missiles and the threat that would pose and the possible escalation it would pose, because there was a time when you were very much in favor of, backing away from this situation in terms of our support of Ukraine.
Well, one of the things I've always said, Martha, is I wanted the Europeans to step up in a big way. I wanted us, the United States, to stop shoveling money and weaponry to a conflict that was so far away, when I felt like the Europeans, with all due respect for them, were not actually taking their fair share of the burden. Because of the president's leadership, you now have the Europeans buying weaponry from the United States as opposed to us giving it. And you asked this question about Tomahawks. It's something the president's going to make the final determination on. What the president is going to do is what's in the best interest of the United States of America. That's the driving light between his foreign policy decisions, between his defense policy decisions, and that will be the same heuristic that we apply to how we answer this question about Tomahawks. I'll let the president speak to it, but I know that we're having conversations this very minute about that issue.
I don't believe that they know what's the best for the United States, and that's why they're...
Several important points that you've brought up with colleagues on the podcast before this one. First, yes, the Tomahawk is nuclear capable. It's a dual warhead type of weapon. And that's been made very clear as a significant strategic threat when the Aegis ashore battery, which fires Tomahawks, was first proposed and then built in Poland, and then with a second battery opened in Romania. President Putin has repeatedly warned that these sites are strategically threatening because there'll be no way of telling, if fired, that they're carrying a nuclear weapon or not. and the President Putin has said for many years. I recall reporting that he said in Athens several years ago, I believe it was 2016, these sites and Romania and Poland are in our crosshairs. Okay, so yes, there is that warning from Russia on the table. Second, while I've heard some of our colleagues say that these Tomahawks have to be operated by Americans, and therefore, if the Russian side decides to hit back at a battery, they will hit Americans. It's true the US would be required to provide much of the satellite tracking guidance intelligence, including live intelligence to guide the weapon. But as I understand it, the British and the Germans could either or both supply Tomahawk batteries, and they would be staffed by British or Germans, not necessarily Americans. So when you heard Vance say, we've got to get the Europeans, it's going to be the European skin in the game, what he really means, it's going to be their skins at risk if we decide to supply, if they are fired, and if the Russians decide to retaliate. Now, my sources in Moscow say that, and I'll just read you what one of the sources has said. You can read it again in Dances with Bears this afternoon. I believe the Russians will secure victory using the Oreshnik, or Oreshniki plural, rather than a massive ground offensive. But there's also a buildup many of us can see. That's why the Europeans and Americans are getting very nervous at the moment, threatening Russians with a direct confrontation unless they back off. Now, that's an interpretation that the US is raising the threat level in a sense to deter the Russian side. But Vance is also making the point that, as has Trump with the paper tiger claim, that they're daring President Putin to prove he isn't a paper tiger. Well, if you're winning a war as systematically as the Russian side is, you don't have to prove you're a paper tiger. It's in reverse. But there is a non-nuclear weapon which the Russian side has demonstrated. But so far, President Putin has declined to order its use, though the Oreshnik is now operational with some Russian units and will be, by the end of the year, as President Putin has said publicly, operational in Belarus. So there's no World War III here. We're not at that point. We are not going nuclear. However, there is a very serious nuclear shadow over any movement of Tomahawks. However, from a Russian point of view, what's just been said by Vance and Trump, and then echoed by Macron, by Merz, and the other Europeans, what's just been said is, let's say, an ultimatum for President Putin to agree with the general staff on ending the war on military terms, because the American side is not offering, not even addressing any terms of settlement, which the Russian side has tabled, which the other side, the Ukrainian, European, American side has tabled. These are statements that are war-making, and they are not for a negotiation. They're posturing.
John, do you mentioned the way that Russia sees the conflict, but so far with all these arguments on the part of the United States, you don't see any practical move. You don't see any, we don't know what's in their mind and what is the main goal on the part of the Trump administration. And is that possible for Russia to consider that, in your opinion? Whatever is in their mind, I don't know. What's your take on that? What do they want from Russia? What is the final goal on the part of the Trump administration that somehow overlaps with the European aim or goal?
It's a very good question, Nima, and the answers are so numerous and complicated that we don't want to mystify ourselves or the audience. And the reason is that the Trump administration is full of people who have slightly different or significantly different aims and objectives here. On the one hand, to repeat something we've said before in our podcast, the planners, the military planners, the war planners of the Pentagon, some of whom are meeting right now or in a few minutes' time in Quantico, Virginia, with Mr. Hegseth and Trump, they have the concept of sequencing of war, that the US will demonstrate its strength, but not by applying force where it can't be victorious, where it can't win. It therefore must mobilize the European resources in the European theater, but short of direct conflict with Russia, except on the Ukrainian battlefield. So they're escalating in Poland, they're escalating in Germany, they're escalating in Finland, in the Baltic states, and then they're escalating into the Far East and in Central and South America. So we've seen war expeditions such as the attack on fishing boats off Venezuela. We've seen attempts to, mobilize Polish, Estonian, even Danish public opinion with the invented, fabricated theories of Russian drones attacking Europe and Russian aircraft entering NATO airspace. So the idea is to make money at this kind of war, make US money without risking US casualties, without the devastating political effect domestically of body bags returning. There is no real US anti-war movement, but there would be if there are casualties. They know that for certain. Significantly also, Trump, Vance, and the rest know they mustn't be seen to lose a war. So you have this demonstration, one after the other, of Trump's peacemaking initiatives, the Nobel Prize-winning candidacies, where he creates peace by bombing, obliterating, his term, Iran's nuclear capacity, by obliterating, I think it's now 2 Venezuelan speedboats, alleged drug runners, must always be seen to be winning, called winning peace, but never be seen to be losing. Now, where can they lose? The answer is 2 battlefields, Taiwan and China in the east, and second, Ukraine in the west. I'm speaking Russian geography. The possibility of losing in the Middle East, we'll come back to the Middle East a bit later, it has been demonstrated by the resilience of Iran and the ingenuity of Iran and its capabilities to attack Israel, the essentially US platform for fighting in the Middle East. So there's a serious risk in those 3 places. So the risk of appearing to lose, a Kabul retreat, a Saigon 75 retreat, that's politically damaging. But even more politically damaging would be body bags. US must not lose American lives on the Ukrainian battlefield. So the logic of what they're saying, to answer your question, is to sequence the wars, to always appear to be winning, to always avoid the risk of losing, and never subject US lives to the possibility of death. And it isn't just body bags in the Vietnam War number. That was serious, and that generated massive anti-war movement in the United States. The Republicans certainly remember the loss of US lives and the failure of Jimmy Carter's hostage rescue mission, 79, just before the election, that Ronald Reagan capitalized on. They must never be seen to lose in that way. Hence, as we've all seen, Trump keeps repeating how brilliantly he pulled off his bombing campaign against Iran. That contrasts how dismally Jimmy Carter pulled off his rescue in the desert and the collapse of the Iranian hostage mission before the election of that year. So that's the way they think. And as I've tried to say before, the polls show them, their polls show them, the public polls show them that they're not succeeding in convincing anybody. They're failing. That leads to more polarization of the voters, more militarization of the US cities. So their idea is win wars starting at home. And that's, as we've described before, the strategy of militarization at home is Stephen Miller's, the deputy chief of staff in the White House. And if you look at and you compare it, the way in which the Democratic voters voted for Harris over Trump, the city votes where Trump did poorest, where the Democrat did best in the last election, those are the cities, and there are a dozen of them, where you will find the Miller, Trump, Vance campaign will try to show force. And the resort to force is what you do when you're losing politically.
John, the other aspect of the foreign policy of the United States is what's going on with the case of Gaza.
Yes.
And Donald Trump, he's talking about his peace plan, and the countries involved, it seems, that are Arab states together with Israel, and Donald Trump is trying to Abraham Accords. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
The same countries that were involved in Abraham Accords. And we don't know yet what is in the peace plan. And they're talking about 21 points in that plan. And
yes,
what we've learned from Hamas, they're talking about, we will not accept any proposal that doesn't include self-determination for the Palestinian people and protect them from massacres. And
yes.
he said that they haven't received it yet, so they cannot comment on that, on the peace plan. But what's your understanding of the meeting between the two, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu? Netanyahu was, if I'm not mistaken, his 5th or 6th. He's been in the United States 5 times since Donald Trump was elected.
Yes.
And what is that? What's the meaning of that to you? And what's the meaning of this? How can we interpret this for the conflict in Gaza, in Palestine?
Well, let me start quickly. I can hold it up. Everybody can read what the White House has put out as its 20-point plan for Gaza. So it's quite right of Hamas to say, until it's officially delivered to us, we can't comment on the details, but they certainly know what the plan was before it was publicly announced by the White House. It's one issue. And I'll come back to the points in a minute. What I found very unusual, but politically understandable in the terms we've just mentioned, is the way in which Trump introduced the plan and the way he spoke in front of Netanyahu. I'll just read you this stuff. It's fairly interesting. He opened the meeting with Netanyahu, the public part, by saying, so this is a big, big day, a beautiful day, potentially one of the greatest days ever in civilization. Suppressed smiles, everybody. Things have been going on for hundreds of years and thousands of years. we're going to, at least we're at a minimum, very, very close. And I think we're beyond very close. Think about what's going on in his head. You asked me to think about it. I just thought that's what he said. He thinks it's one of the greatest days ever in civilization that he's pulling off with Netanyahu and the Israelis. And then what he says a bit later, nobody's been better than Israel. No president has been better to Israel than Donald Trump. We had a long, strong talk, Bibi and I, and he understands. It's time. It's time. History has shown, and the people of Israel want it. Well, that's more than just a pitch at Jewish voters to stay loyal to Trump, to stick with MAGA and MEGA. It's an extraordinary belief that Trump has. I wouldn't say religious belief. He's quite irreligious, atheistic. That he is, in a sense, the greatest thing that's ever happened to the Jewish people and Israel and the Zionist cause and the history of all the peoples of the Middle East. He's the greatest thing in the history of civilization. Now, he thinks that almost, but he's pitching that. Who is he pitching it to? Well, there's no doubt he's pitching it. The Zionist lobby, the Jewish contributors to his campaign. He's trying to make sure that they will stay with him. That's my understanding of what he's doing. My understanding of what Netanyahu is doing is bending him around his little finger, since he understands what Trump is going to say. And it's an extraordinary confession of a US president of subservience to the Jewish people, the Israeli state, and the Zionist ideology. I don't think that anything can be beaten by Trump's exaggeration and hyperbole there. What you then come to is this 20-point plan. Now, allegedly negotiated by Jared Kushner and Stephen Witkoff. Okay, let's just say, to clarify one point you made about the Arabs who endorsed it, there's a huge difference between this piece of paper, which is the joint statement by the Arabs, by the foreign ministers of Jordan, UAE, Indonesia, Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Egypt. They make a joint statement, but it's very far from endorsing the detailed points of the plan. The points of the plan are essentially an Israeli agreement not to annex Gaza, but to control everything that will forever move in that place. And they've been first to demilitarize and destroy Hamas in Gaza. Second, to potentially allow Hamas to surrender on a safe conduct. I can't imagine anyone from Hamas accepting any Israeli safe conduct pass. Can you? Second, the demilitarization, destruction of the arms must proceed at a rate the Israelis will control. They won't withdraw until a series of stages have occurred in demilitarization. Second, the installation of a non-political, I think the plan calls it apolitical Palestinian group. Excuse me, folks. Is there any Palestinian who can be possibly considered apolitical? No. That's impossible. No adult, no child Palestinian, no Arab could be considered apolitical unless it's judged by the Israelis to be under their direct control. So the transition Palestinian Authority composed of apoliticals is a nonsense. The additional nonsense is the plan creates, what do they call it? Board of Peace, the BOP. Okay, the BOP. And that's to be run by Tony Blair, the man who's been taking money from everybody to pretend that he's on their side. Okay, so Trump's the president of BOP. Blair is his deputy, the president of BOP and the prime minister of BOP, and they're to supervise a slow transition from the apolitical Palestinians to the introduction of a military force that's primarily going to include maybe Pakistan. The Muslims will be carefully selected, maybe Pakistanis on a Saudi salary, maybe Indonesians, who knows? But they'll be supervised by BOP and controlled by the Israelis. It's a stage in which Israel moves out very slowly, if at all, over a period of time not defined, on Israeli safe conduct and guarantees that are worthless to a Palestinian. And even that much, as I understand, has been reacted to negatively by the fanatics, let's call them some of the conservative members of Netanyahu's coalition. So as a plan goes, it's a series of steps that meet most of Netanyahu's objectives, that makes it President Trump look the peacemaker. And it leaves out a key Arab and Iranian elements. Certainly Iran, Yemen, the Houthis will not accept this. Iraq is missing from the list. Of course, if one looked at Arab history, without Saddam Hussein, without Hafez al-Assad, without Muammar Gaddafi, without Nasser of Egypt, what you've got are a collection of toadies. And but even the toadies couldn't assemble in their statement of support for Trump anything more than a statement of how much they respected and were pleased by Trump's plan. I'm shuffling papers to see if I can find the language again, and I can't. The Qataris have accepted a telephone apology for killing one man from Israel, a Qatari policeman, and they appear to have accepted that the Israelis tried to kill the decision-making Politburo of Hamas and failed. Now imagine if they succeeded. Imagine that the plan of the US and the Israelis succeeded in killing the Politburo in Qatar. There wouldn't be anybody left for the plan to be enforced. Who would you deliver the 20 points to? You've just decapitated the entire leadership. From then, so you know that was their objective. And they've made it clear. They simply apologized that this poor Qatari policeman got in the way. And Qatar has the lack of sovereignty and the lack of honor and the lack of credibility to sign a statement appreciating the effort President Trump had just made. It's ridiculous. However, we live in the world we live in. And as I said, Saddam, Gaddafi, Hafez, and Nasser are all dead. Some of them wiped out by this American-Israeli combination. So there isn't an Arab resistance as such, but there are the Houthis and there are the Iranians. And the Arab world isn't complying with this. We'll see how it goes, but essentially it's well, maybe I've just said enough. It's an exaggeration that can hardly be credible for what it says on paper, and for the Palestinians to accept a new form of mandate from a British person like Blair, a new British mandate called BOP. This is ludicrous.
I was so amazed to see Tony Blair popping up, and what's that? Who's pushing for that? Do you think it's Israel pushing for him to be part of the?
No, he pushes for it. It's worth money and reputation to him. He's pushing for it. The British government's pushing for it. Starmer is pushing for it. It's a demonstration, is it not, of the revival of the special relationship, of the importance of the British in the future of Palestine. I'm saying things which are nonsensical, but the British believe it. And it's Blair's role in this will be endorsed by the Rupert Murdoch press in London and by the Financial Times, no doubt. It adds to Blair's pocket. It makes the Labour Party government seem to be contributing to peace. It mollifies the Israelis a little, that Starmer's recognition of the Palestinian state is offset by the role that the BOP will play to give Israel everything they want in Gaza and the West Bank too.
Yeah. John, the other character in the conflict in the foreign policy of the United States since Donald Trump was elected is Steve Witkoff. When it comes to Russia, it seems that Russia believes that Steve Witkoff has tried to do everything to somehow do something for the case of Ukraine. But what we've learned from just 2 days ago, we've learned from the Iranian part. They say that every time they talk with Witkoff and he got back to the United States, he said something totally different. Many cases 180-degree different from what they were talking about. They don't believe that Steve Witkoff is a reliable negotiator. And who's this guy? And why is that the case? Because they're trying to push the case of Iran, because Donald Trump is threatening Iran. They're talking about, they say that Netanyahu wants to attack Iran again.
Yes.
If Netanyahu attacks Iran, the United States definitely would join Netanyahu, because Israel alone cannot do anything, let's be honest, and in that concept.
Yes.
What's your understanding of that?
Well, just to reinforce the last point you made, in this press appearance, it wasn't a press conference, there were no questions and answers, that Netanyahu and Trump had in the White House, Iran was named, but also was criticized as implied to be the next enemy. The tyranny of terror was the way in which both Netanyahu and Trump referred to Iran as the next stage, having, they think, or they say, or they wish to have wiped out Palestinian resistance. The tyranny of terror that remains is Iran principally. Then Trump softens that a bit. I can't find my piece of paper where he says something like, let's see if he's hoping that that Iran will join the Abraham Accords. I mean, this is fanciful, because at the same time he celebrates his destruction of their nuclear capability. He again repeats what a great job he did by eliminating the JCPOA, the agreement on nuclear weapons development in Iran, and so on. So he tries to soften his position towards Iran. So I agree with your point, and I'm glad you made it. And Trump's evidence, Netanyahu's evidence, confirms it. Go back to Witkoff. The question you asked was asked of President Putin not so long ago. I believe he was asked this question in a press conference in Beijing. What do you think that Mr. Witkoff has been telling Washington? Has he been misleading them? Your question was asked, and President Putin answered something like, Mr. Witkoff has visited us 4 or 5 times, and we have every reason to believe he's delivered to President Trump exactly what we told him. So why did Mr. Putin say that? First, because he needed to preserve the money side of the negotiation. It being the Kirill Dmitriev theory that you could persuade Trump with money, bribes for the family, for the Witkoff family, for the Howard Lutnick family, the Secretary of Commerce, and others. You could bribe them directly, and you could induce them to reduce or lift or not enforce sanctions against Russian business in schemes that involve Boeing, involve ExxonMobil, involve a range of major US corporations that are politically influential. Witkoff was seen as the bagman, opposite the Russian bagman, to create a range of incentives for return to business as usual in that way, with the object to be a bunch of business deals which would be associated with not removing sanctions, it's too difficult, but not enforcing sanctions. That's the easy part that Trump could achieve by executive order. So the Russian side wanted to preserve Witkoff's credibility as a bagman. No sense in damaging the credibility of a bagman. What credibility does a bagman have? Ultimately, that's his purpose, but Russians are very polite people, and they're not going to say we understood that's his purpose, and he delivered. But he didn't deliver. He didn't deliver. The latest round of talk from Trump and Vance proves that the Russian side haven't been able to achieve anything on the so-called Dmitriev business front, on the bagman front. So Witkoff has failed. Okay. Second, as you said, the Iranians see him as having betrayed his own words. And we've talked about this. You remember it better than I do. I believe Witkoff told the Iranians during the Omani mediation that so long as the negotiations were understood to be in good faith and continuing to be constructive, concrete, and progressive, there'd be no attack on Iran. And he betrayed that, didn't he? So from an Iranian point of view, there's no doubt that his role as a bagman is that the Russians valued, but not any longer, was zero. His value as a mouthpiece promising U.S. And control over Israel and no attack on him. That turned out he's a liar, a dishonest negotiator. So it therefore isn't surprising the Iranians have concluded that whatever they told him, he carried back either a different message or the message was ignored. Either way, the Trump administration was intent on attacking Iran, and Witkoff was simply delaying the inevitable, and the Iranians have woken up. Now, from a Russian point of view, taking into account that President Putin believes that Witkoff took everything back to Trump, the Russian side said, let's try it and see what Trump actually says. And that's what Anchorage was for. That's what the summit meeting that President Putin agreed to have on U.S. territory when he proposed the UAE. It was designed to establish in the Russian mind, but principally the president of Russia, did Trump understand the terms of settlement? And just to shorten them, not the 33, does he understand Russia's root cause? The root cause of the war is Russian insecurity because of the advancing threats of the Americans, NATO powers using the Ukrainian platform and all the other platforms. Does Trump understand root cause? Answer now, it's clear. No, he doesn't. We've just said it. You asked the right question, Nima. Trump and Vance issue serious statements at the UN, breathing into Macron's ear, and then on television on Sunday. Serious statements showing that no interest in what Russian terms are. They've ignored them. They've dismissed them. They don't discuss them. They use that other general, Keith Kellogg, the Witkoff double who negotiated the 22 terms of the European American Zelensky proposal for end of war. Used him to say, yes, I'm in favor of deep strikes, no sanctuaries in Russia, escalate the war. So it's an end. There's nothing Witkoff can do anymore because he's proved that even if he carried back the message in detail, the points, he had a White House notebook that he showed off when he last went to the White House. He scribbled in his notebook. He had a note taker with him. There's no doubt he relayed that stuff, and not only to Trump, but to Rubio and to others, anyone who asked. But it doesn't matter. They've dismissed it. They've never addressed it. It's the most extraordinary non-negotiation. And so I believe the answer to your question is the Iranians came to the understanding Witkoff was a liar. They came first to that understanding, but they paid a serious military price in life and loss for discovering he was a liar. The Russians have come later to understand that as a bagman goes, his bag's empty, and the other side is neither on the take, nor is it ready to negotiate any terms. End of Witkoff's role. Maybe he could go to Congo now, maybe to Azerbaijan now. Send him somewhere where people are still naive about what a bagman means and what a liar says.
Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure.
Thank you for having me. We'll see you next week. Maybe it won't be so funny next week. But as I said at the beginning, we could interpret them as mad. We could.
Yeah.
Maybe next week that's what we'll conclude. They're mad, quite mad.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.